I'd like to thank Jonathan for appearing tonight to help make that possible. Town Hall will be continuing to produce virtual content this fall, including our podcast, In the Moment, which will now feature exclusive guests, and many of our past talks are also available in video or podcast form on our digital media library. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include BJ Cummings with James Rasmussen and Paulina Lopez about the impact of the Duwamish River on our region, Richard Scholar with Kathleen Kane about French words that have been adopted into the English language, and our 14th annual Urban Poverty Forum with a focus on Black voter suppression. Town Hall and the nonprofit community at large have been put under significant strain due to the event cancellations and ever-changing landscape. As we hope you will consider extending your generosity to help support us during this difficult time by making a donation by clicking the donate button at the bottom of your screen or becoming a member. You can make a donation online or text Town Hall to 44321 to give. Our partner booksellers have been hit by the negative effects of the COVID outbreak and can use your support as well. If you're interested in supporting local independent bookstores by purchasing a copy of the book being presented tonight, please use the link in the live stream page to purchase through Third Place Books. For viewers who want to watch this broadcast with closed captioning, we recommend viewing the stream via our YouTube page linked here in the chat. To enable real-time closed captioning, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. The video will be available for rewatching immediately following tonight's broadcast. Tonight's presentation will be about 30 minutes, followed by Q&A. Jonathan will select from those questions in the Ask a Question field at the bottom center of your screen. You can also vote on which questions will be addressed by clicking the arrow next to the questions to upload it. We cannot guarantee that we will be able to address every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. Please keep your questions concise and in the form of a question. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Arno Matulski Science Series is supported by Microsoft, KUOW, Wyncote Foundation Northwest, and the taxpayers of Washington. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of our members watching tonight. Jonathan Slaght is a wildlife biologist and author who works full-time for the Wildlife Conservation Society as the Russia and Northeast Asia coordinator. His writing, scientific research, and photographs have been featured by the BBC World Service, the New York Times, The Guardian, Smithsonian Magazine, and The New Yorker, among others. Jonathan's book, Owls of the Eastern Ice, A Quest to Find and Save the World's Largest Owl, is the subject of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Slaght.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks to Town Hall for hosting, and thanks to everyone who's watching in from home. I think it is important to be supporting institutions like Town Hall, so thank you. So I wrote a book about an owl, and the Blackinson's fish owl. And this is an owl probably unlike any other that you've known. These are really big birds. You know, they stand as tall as a fire hydrant and weigh as much as 11 crows. And they have these 6-foot wingspans. But the book is also about the people who share the forests with fish owls. And it's a story about field work. And it's a story about a place where humans are decidedly not in control. Nature is. So over the next 30 minutes or so, I'll tell you why this owl is special, why I've devoted 20 years of my life to its protection, and then outline the basic events that went into the book. So first, some background. This story takes place in a Russian province called Primoria, and it's way over here in Northeast Asia. There's about 2 million people that live in this province, half of whom live in the capital city of Vladivostok. And the remainder are really scattered in these relatively small human settlements, such as this one, Ternay, about 3,000 people. And these settlements are often, tucked where they can fit between rivers and the mountains of the Sikhatay Aline. A lot of the landscape here, I would say, when most people first see it, they don't think of this as Russia. People don't think of Russia and think of sandy beaches and clear water and just beautiful coastline. And there are these huge, clean rivers meandering through the river valleys here. And it's a land of exotic animals. This is where most of the Amur, also called Siberian tigers, are found in the world. There's leopards here. There's brown bears. In fact, this is the only place in the world where brown bears, tigers, and leopards share the same forests. Bears and tigers do interact, and they do sometimes kill each other. A couple other of the interesting mammals here are raccoon dogs. These are true dogs. They're canids, and it's the only member of the dog family that hibernates in winter. Another one is the Siberian musk deer, which I like to refer to as vampire kangaroos. You can see the elongated canines that the males here have. So this is where I was in the year 2000 in the Peace Corps. I was in a small village called Lazo when I first saw a Blackisten's fish owl. And I'm going to read just the very first paragraph of the book to give you a flavor for what that encounter was like. I saw my first Blackisten's fish owl in the Russian province of Primoria, a coastal talon of land hooking south into the belly of Northeast Asia. This is a remote corner of the world, not far from where Russia, China, and North Korea meet in a tangle of mountains and barbed wire. On a hike in the forest there in 2000, a companion and I unexpectedly flushed an enormous and panicked bird. Taken to the air with labored flaps, it hooted its displeasure, then landed for a moment in the bare canopy perhaps a dozen meters above our heads. This disheveled mass of wood chip brown regarded us warily with electric yellow eyes. We were uncertain at first which bird actually we'd come across. It was clearly an owl, but bigger than any I'd seen, about the size of an eagle, but fluffier and more portly, with enormous ear tufts. Backlit by the hazy gray of the winter sky, it seemed almost too big and too comical to be a real bird, as if someone had hastily glued fistfuls of feathers to a yearling bear, then propped the dazed beast in the tree. Having decided that we were a threat, the creature pivoted to escape, crashing through the trees as its 2-meter wingspan clipped the lattice of branches. Flakes of displaced bark spiraled down as the bird flew out of sight. So when I saw this thing, I didn't even know it was a fish owl, but fish owl it was, and that really started this several decades long fascination with the species. There are a couple things that really set fish owls apart from other owls, and I'm going to go over 2 of those things right now. When you look at most owl species in the world, one thing that sticks out immediately is this facial disc, this round feather pattern on their faces, and the function of that is to channel sound directly to their ear holes, which means that they have hypersensitive hearing. Now look at a fish owl's face. I mean, sure, the facial disc is there a little bit, but it's not nearly as defined as in some of these other owls. Another thing about owls is another attribute commonly associated with owls is silent flight. Now here's the primary flight feather of a Eurasian eagle owl. And you can see at the top edge there, all these little comb-like protrusions sticking up. So the function of those is to essentially create, to displace the wind. So when an owl flaps, the air just gets pushed away and it muffles the sound. And if you look at a Blackisten's fish owl primary feather, those protrusions are entirely absent. Now, think about this. So fish owls don't need to sit quietly in a forest and quietly sneak up on a rodent that's flitting around in the understory. They're going after a prey that's underwater, so can't really hear them anyway, and their prey live in these rocky rivers that are quite loud. And so these are just features common to most owls that are just not important for owls to do fish owls to do their thing. There are really 2 features on the landscape that fish owls need to survive. They need to have really, really big trees to nest in. These are trees. These are cottonwoods and elms that get to meter and a half in diameter, 200 to 300 years old. This really big trees for a really big bird to nest in. So that's critical for fish owls. There's a couple examples. And then the other thing they need is access to prey year-round. These birds are non-migratory, yet they live in places that get to the -30s in winter, where most waterways freeze. So conveniently, there are a number of radioactive radon hot springs in Primoria, and some of these seep into the waterways, which elevate the water temperature just enough to keep certain patches of water reliably ice-free year in and year out. So if you got a place that has water like this and has big trees, that's really good fish owl habitat. So over the centuries, there hasn't been much pressure on these resources for fish owls. These images here are of indigenous Udege from about 100 years ago. And there was some mild hunting pressure by the Udege, and they liked to catch fish owls in autumn, especially when these big owls put on these thick fat reserves. So they're nice fatty bird. And they also used they'd spread their wings and their tails to use as fans. But that was about it. I mean, it was pretty, not a lot of threats from humans. And even into the Soviet Union, there wasn't much trouble. So this map here is Ternay County, which is the northernmost county in Primoria, showing the road network in 1984. So less than 150 miles of road then. Fast forward 20 years, and suddenly that's blossomed to almost 3,000 miles of road in this relatively short period of time. And this is really good fish owl habitat. So you have a place where for centuries there's essentially been no threats to the owls, and suddenly you've got 3,000 miles of road. There could be some real problems here. The issue was that fish owls have been so poorly studied and so poorly known that we didn't know what the threats were exactly or how to mitigate these threats. So I met up with these two Sergeys, Sergei Avdiuk and Sergei Surmich, who'd been studying fish owls together for about a decade before I came into the picture. And they shared my concern about fish owls and the potential for these threats. So we decided to come up with a plan to learn more about fish owls. We're going to catch some. We're going to put little GPS backpacks on them and use that information to see where they went to then develop a conservation plan. Now, this was the basis for my PhD project at the University of Minnesota. It's definitely a little risky tying my degree to something so uncertain. Like, we didn't even know if we could catch fish owls. If the project failed, not only would we not be able to help owls, but then I would have wasted years of my life on a project that didn't pan out. So the project was broken into 3 phases. The first phase was a 2-week trip to extreme northern Primoria, a place that the roads hadn't even gotten to yet. So I had to fly in there by helicopter. And I was part of a 4-man team for 2 weeks, just looking for fish owls. And it was a pretty gnarly trip. I mean, we were on snowmobiles. We strapped everything we could on these 2 sleds, including all of our food, and you can see a barrel for fuel there, and just went along the river looking for fish owls. Again, no roads here, so really the frozen river was the only travel corridor. And we spent these 2 weeks looking for fish owls. And for me, it was a training experience in how to learn how to do this work. And so there were 3 things that we looked for on this trip. The first was tracks in the snow. So if we ever found one of these open patches of water, we'd walk up to it and look for tracks. This was a good sign that fish owls were hunting here, because they hunt by walking up and down a riverbank and sitting and waiting in ambush for a fish to swim by. The second thing we were looking for were feathers clinging to branches. Fish owls seem to constantly be releasing these really long semi-plume feathers that quite easily cling to branches. And so if you're walking around the woods, in winter with no leaves on the trees, the sun hits these little flags just shimmering, and that's a good indication that fish owls are present and there might be a nest nearby. And the third thing was keying in on some of these big trees. So if we found a large tree, walk up to it, have a look around, see if it's maybe a fish owl nest. So for the duration of this expedition, when we could, we stayed in hunter cabins. And as we're traveling up and down the river, we were constantly flummoxed by what's known in Russian as a nalid, which essentially means on the ice. And so, as you can see here, excuse me, it's a section where, for whatever reason, water is flowing on top of the river channel, and so it's hard to know ahead of time if that's just open water, and if you walk into it or drive your snowmobile into it, that you'll go down a meter to the bottom of the river, or if it's just a very, very thin layer of water flowing on top. So we'd find these things. In some cases, they were very narrow like this. And if we found that they were relatively shallow, we'd try to motor our way across. And we wouldn't always make it. And so, as I was finding with on that 2-week expedition, a lot of field work is really about logistics and just getting from point A to point B to point C safely. And that toward the end of that trip, we really did just kind of gun it for the coast, because it was already spring and the river ice was melting, and we just needed to get to a human settlement safely. So the second phase of the project took place in spring 2006, which was a several-month period where just Sergey and I traveled through the road network in Ternia County, looking for or checking up on some nest trees and some territories of fish owls that he had found in the decade leading up to our collaboration. So we'd stay in hunter cabins, either ones that we just came across or cabins of his friends. This is one of his friends, Volva. And so this was a nice experience, really, because there wasn't a lot of pressure here. We were just driving around, camping, staying in cabins, looking for fish owls. The big problem came in the third phase of the project, which was captures. And this was a 4-year period of trying to find and capture and collect data from fish owls. And this was I would call it a low point in my life, because I was in the woods again, largely with Sergey, and it was cold. It's getting to the -30s, and we're just out in the woods trying to catch owls that we didn't know really how to catch. And we'd be sleeping in these tents, or in this tent. And it would be so cold that ice would form inside, and we'd be laying there at night, and anytime we'd move, the ice would just sort of rain down like little glass slivers, and it was pretty unpleasant. So there was a few weeks of this where we're trying to catch owls. We're setting out traps. The owls are not coming to our traps, or the owls are coming to our traps and then getting away. And then Sergey runs into this guy in the woods. This is a hermit named Anatoly, and he'd been living in the woods for about a decade on his own. And it's just so, and he was living in an abandoned hydroelectric station, and right where this hydroelectric station was, it was kind of between two territories where we were trying to catch owls. So Anatoly just, he invited us to stay with him. He's again a hermit. He was interested in talking to someone, so and we ended up staying with him over several seasons. So that was a good experience for us. Now, field work. The field work for this project was not unlike any other field work for certainly in Primoria. If you want water, you get a bucket, you go to the river. If you want fish, punch a hole in the ice and drop in your line. If you want to cook something, dig out a hole in the snow and start a fire. And so the book Owls of the Eastern Ice largely developed from my field notes from this time. Everything here was Russian. I was speaking Russian, interacting with my Russian colleagues, and so I tried every day, if possible, to carve out a half hour to an hour, to put in earplugs, sit somewhere, and just write down my observations from the day. So not just about how the trapping was going, but also idiosyncrasies of Anatoly, or things that Sergei was doing that was good or was irritating. And so it was a way to express myself cleanly in my native language, and to be able to say exactly what I wanted to say and let off some steam. So it was cathartic, and it was useful for me to do that. So after the field season was almost over, the first field season, 2007, and I almost didn't think we were going to catch any owls, when suddenly we played with our methodologies enough, switched up our traps to the point where we found a combination that worked, and suddenly we started catching owls, and we ended up catching 4 owls at the end of by the end of the 2007 season, which was the target we were looking for. But I mean, I think 3 of those came in a week-long period. So once it worked, and it was good. So here's an owl just before release, and you can kind of make a little thing on its back there. That's the GPS data logger. So it's about a little bigger than a stick of gum. And what these things do is collect a GPS point 1 to 2 times a day for about a year, depending on how it's programmed. And then the trick is to recapture the same bird a year later, to download that information. So after the 2007 season, which was really focused just in one geographical area, now that we had a trap that worked, we expanded our reach and moved to even more remote places, looking for finding and catching owls. And this is where we lived. We lived in a Gaz 66, which is kind of a workhorse of the Russian transportation world. And this has a 2-room compartment built onto the back. You can see a wood stove pipe coming out the back there. So there were 2 to 5 of us every season. We kind of had a rotating cast of field assistants. It was always me and Sergei, but then with some other people also involved. And we would bring up to 6 weeks worth of food with us, and cram into this thing and just head out. As you may imagine, having 2 to 5 people living in a tiny box in the middle of the woods, personality conflicts can come out, and there were some issues among different members of the crew, and things definitely got stinky. There were not too many places to bathe at -30 in the middle of a Russian winter. I mentioned some radon hot springs earlier. And we would often try to park our truck near one of these if they were around, because that at least offered a place to bathe that was not absolutely freezing. The water wasn't super warm, but it was better than freezing water. Now, as an aside, I was leading a bit of a double life during this period, where I'd be in a truck with Andre and Shurik in the middle of the Russian woods. Then I'd go back to Minnesota and do things like go to movies and get married. And then next thing I know, I'm back in the truck again with Andre and Shurik in the middle of the Russian woods. So I would like to underscore how on our own we were for a lot of this field work. And we were usually pretty far from human settlements. And if something happens, we're on our own. Here, for example, we the tire became unseated from the rim, and that's the kind of thing that typically requires an actual specific tool to reseat it. But here we are at this point 80 kilometers from the closest village, closest human settlement, and even that place has just a few hundred people, and they probably don't even have the right tool. So this is one of the reasons I was so thankful that I was working with Sergei Avdeyuk, because he knew how to live out here. And so his fix here was to pour gasoline inside the rim there and then light it on fire, so that then the explosion just reseats it, and then we could pump up the tire and be on our way. And so it's going to happen fast here, so pay attention. So, and he could also fix the GAZ-66, which was constantly breaking down. So yes, Sergei was a really wonderful person to be in the field with. I felt very, very safe with him around. We would every once in a while have these random people stop by. If you have a truck that's suddenly parked next to a hot spring and people want to go to that hot spring, they're going to come knock on our door. And sometimes they want to drink, sometimes they're just curious to know who we are. And even if the timing was bad, even if we were about to go try to catch an owl, or we'd been up all night and things hadn't been going well, we just needed some sleep, we certainly felt obligated to be gracious hosts and talk to people and get their opinions about things and just be sociable. And one of the reasons for this is that we really came to depend on our local contacts in these remote areas. So if suddenly we have a truck or we have a car go through the river and we need to find somebody with a winch, if we'd offended people in town, they're not going to want to come help us. But if we'd made friends, then then they might come help us. So why does this all matter? Like, why does what I did 10 years ago in the middle of the Russian woods, why does that matter to us in the United States? Why does that matter to any of you watching now? Well, remember that map that I showed you earlier of the road network kind of extending into Ternay County? Well, all of those roads go through the river valleys, because the region is so mountainous. I mean, you can see the white river here, then the dirt road, crossing the river. And here's some of the data we got from the fish owls. There's the different colors represent GPS locations. So there's 4 different owls represented here. And essentially all of our owls were in river valleys. There was something like 0.04% of our locations were outside river valleys. So all the human use is concentrated on the river valleys, and all the owls are also using the river valleys. So what are these roads being used for? A lot of it's logging. Most of those roads are built specifically to extract wood from the forests. Now, I would say that the logging is generally good. It's reasonably sustainable, and it's selective harvest, so it's not clear cutting. But there's a lot of wood coming out of Primoria, and some of it comes here. I mean, wood from Primoria's forests become floors in North America and in Europe. And the roads also provide access to for fish. Some of it is illegal. There's a huge illegal industry targeting the salmon roe of the fish that migrate up these rivers. But there's also a lot of legal fishing, and fish from Primoria's waters are sold all across Asia. So I think what happens in Primoria matters everywhere for people and for the owls. And so this is what conservation is, right? It's finding solutions that so we have this resource that's being used by humans and being used by fish owls. And so finding solutions that benefit both people and fish owls is really what I do, and using scientific data to get at some of those answers. So the first thing we did with our data from the project was to create a predictive map using showing where in Primoria fish owls either were or were most likely to be. And we shared this map with the dominant logging company in the region, showing them, for example, okay, this is a good spot for fish owls. So if you're going to build a road through this valley, put it over there rather than over here. Or there happens to be a patch of old growth forest, which is incidentally commercially worthless, comparatively speaking, for the logging companies, because the trees that the fish owls need they're all big and rotting. They're not worth much money. So they're sometimes putting roads through these things, not realizing that it's bad for the owls. But so now they know not to do that. And then another thing we're doing with this logging company is identifying some roads that lead to higher biodiversity areas and just blocking them off. I mean, the logging company doesn't need to log up there for another 20 years. So it doesn't matter to them if the road is blocked off, but it matters to fish owls, and it matters to tigers, and it matters to salmon. So another outcome, another conservation outcome of this project was the understanding how limited nest trees really are for fish owls. When trees get as big as they do, to become once they're ready to be fish owl nests, 200 or 300 years old, they're fragile, and they can be knocked down in the seasonal typhoons, or in the case in this picture here, sometimes they were being cut down for bridges across small waterways. And so the understanding that fish owls were losing these critical resources and are also long-lived. So there's a record from Japan of a fish owl that's nearly 30. The fish owls, they'll stay in a territory and not breed if there's not a tree. And so that's, if you have an endangered species that's not breeding, that's not going to help its status. So we took cues from Japanese biologists who have been putting nest boxes in trees for about 20 years, more than that, since this is the early 80s. And we bought some old barrels that used to have soybean oil in them, cut a hole in the side, painted them, put on a perch, and put them up in put the first one up in a tree in a territory where, over a decade of monitoring, the pair had lost 4 nest trees, 3 of them to natural causes and 1 to a bridge. And then we put a camera up there just to see if they found it. And it took them less than a week, actually, to find it. This was in 2015. And since then, the fish owl pair has bred in here and raised chicks on 3 occasions. It's the outcomes of this project for me are very satisfying. Wildlife conservation, like many professions, is filled with uncertainty. People like me can spend our entire lives designing studies and collecting data and using that information to guide conservation. But sometimes it's hard to know if our efforts have any real impact. So, for me, knowing that right now, there are fish owls flapping around Primoria because Sergey and I strapped some barrels to trees, because we're working with loggers to reduce the harm of that industry. It feels good. We're not saving an entire species from this project, but we're helping. We are helping to manage the landscape where a number of them live, up to about 200 pairs. And to the owls that are alive because of our interventions, it does matter. Although I will say that they do not always appreciate our efforts. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. That was great. So now is audience Q&A time. So folks in the audience, if you have a question for Jonathan, if there's something that you were dying to learn about that we didn't get to address, feel free to put it in the Ask a Question box, which is at the bottom of your screen. And let's start there with our first question is from Dan. So can you describe the traps that you were using to catch the owls?
Sure. I mean, the basic thing we were missing was that, the owls have these relatively large territories, and they have these different patches of open water throughout their territories, and it was almost impossible for us to really understand which ones they were using when. So what we started doing was ice fishing and catching fish from the rivers, then putting them in a little box in a spot of open water that was convenient for us. And so having these lures to bring the owls in was key. So an owl might not find it the first night, might not find it the second, the third, the fourth, but eventually it finds it. And then once it does, it's hooked. I mean, it's they come back, they stay there all night, they empty the thing of fish, and then just kind of stare at it for a while. Almost like, when's the magic fish box going to give us more fish? And then as soon as it gets dark the next night, they come back. So we kind of designed the trap around that lure.
And you mentioned in your talk that there was at some point a successful trap, that the fish was sort of like the eureka. What were the things that you were doing before the successful fish trap?
Yeah, well, we were using what I would call standard raptor capture traps. So there's a 1,000 years history of people catching raptors, and so people have compiled this information, and so we were kind of just going through the most obvious ones, or things that we thought would be most productive, and mostly it's just some kind of a lure, maybe, and then a snare to just or nets. So just pretty standard things for raptor capture, and none of them are working.
C'est la vie. All right, so our next one from an audience member. Can you tell us how many fish owls exist and whether their numbers are declining?
Sure. There's between it's hard to know exactly how many there are, because they extend pretty far north of Primoria, and it's difficult to know exactly. Natural conditions seem worse there, so we assume that densities are lower, but we don't know for sure, and it's incredibly expensive to try to get there to look, so we haven't. But so we're thinking they're up to 850 pairs, 500 to 850 pairs, so less than 2,000 birds total. And there are two subspecies. There are fewer than 200 birds that live in Japan and on some of the Russian islands nearby. And all my work is on with the mainland subspecies. So there's more of them, but there's still not that many. And how the population's doing? The population in Japan is doing much better. I mean, they were almost extinct in the early 1980s, and they've just the Japanese biologists and with support from the government of Japan have just done amazing things to. There's fewer than 200 there now, but there were fewer than 80 a few decades ago. So they've really improved there. As far as how the mainland population's going, I would say they're doing okay. I mean, they're not doing great, but it's not. We're not seeing a population crash. I would say that most of the threats to them are where I work, because that's where most of the people are, and I think we're working to protect them there.
Great. All right, our next question I think is a good kind of follow-up to a lot of what you were just talking about. What sort of government support or difficulties did you have while on this quest, while doing your research?
Sure. Well, it's as a foreigner, I can't do anything with endangered species without essentially a government partner. And so Sergei Sormuch, who's one of the Sergeys, I didn't work with him much in the field, but he's a long-term collaborator and friend. He works for the Russian Academy of Sciences. So that was so by having an official collaboration with the Russian Academy of Sciences, we could do this work. So all the permitting for all the captures, for all this stuff, that was all handled by him, and it worked pretty well.
Okay, I think this is also a good follow-up to that question. So what was the attitude towards conservation from the people that lived in that part of Russia? Is conservation generally valued, or did you get any pushback?
Yeah, Yeah, this comes up just a little bit in the book. People thought when we'd go out in this truck, most people were convinced that we were working some angle. It's like, what do you mean you're looking for birds? Like, it just didn't, it just didn't really compute. And these are people who live really hard lives, living in the middle of the woods. This one town that we went to a lot called Amgu, they were cut off. There were all these floods, and they were cut off from the rest of the world for about a month. And it's like it didn't faze them that there was nothing new coming in. There was no produce, no new supplies, because they just went out along with their lives. They fished in the ocean. They went to the woods for deer. It just didn't matter that. I mean, imagine not getting anything for a month, but it was fine. So, and even people that we came to know and had local contacts with, they still kind of thought we had something going on. Like, okay, you're catching owls, but you're selling them, right? Like, between us, you're selling them to zoos. And it was just really hard to understand that we were doing this just for the good of owls.
Did the folks there have a kind of attitude about the owls themselves? Like, did they feel a sense of like hometown pride over the species? Was there some kind of connection with the feathers being? How did people feel about the owls? Did they have a love and a fondness for them as a creature?
Most people didn't know they existed. And for the largest owl species in the world, they are remarkably good at not being seen. They tend to fly away. If they can tell a human's approaching, they tend to fly away at 100 yards, 150 yards. Mm-hmm. So yeah, they're good at not being seen, and they vocalize at strange times, and the vocalization is very low, so it's not super noticeable. So yeah, so a lot of the places we went to, we talked to people that say, nope, no owls here, and then we'd find one just right nearby. So yeah, and even some hunters, there were stories of people who would see this giant thing in a tree, so they'd shoot it just to see what it was, and be like, oh, it's a really big owl, and then kind of move on. So
just another day in the life. Yeah. Another question that I think is a good follow-up to that. So here's how I'm going to read it verbatim. So here in the Pacific Northwest, we have big trees and rivers with lots of fish. Why don't we have fish owls here? Also, do you have any video of fish owls fishing?
Okay. Why are there no fish owls in North America? I mean, I think it's just geographical distribution of bird species. I mean, there aren't bald eagles in Asia. I mean, not really. I mean, stragglers. There's no breeders. So it's just one of those things that they just don't. It's just not a North American species. There are 4 fish owl species in total. They all live in Asia. Blackiston's is easily the biggest, and they get smaller as they go down. So they're in India, they're in Malaysia. So it's just not a North American species. Was there another question in there?
If you have any video of fish owls fishing.
I do have some. I don't have, what I have is not very good because it was just data collection for me. So I wasn't trying to do anything too fancy. I will say though that there's a documentary that's on Disney Plus now called Wild Russia, and one of the episodes, I think it's called The Forested South. It has fish owls in it, and those were fish owls that film crew was working in the woods when I was there trying to catch owls. So it's some of the owls that are talked about in the book are the owls that you see fishing, and they did a nice job getting some fishing shots. So if you have Disney Plus, look it up.
Very cool. Yeah, and also if you have a Disney Plus login, feel free to throw it in the ask a question. Just kidding, everybody. We have a question about why they're called the Blackenson fish owl. If you want to talk about that and maybe the other names as well.
Sure. I mean, there was it's a species that's been known to people for centuries. I mean, in Japan, there are these wonderful scrolls of very detailed fish owls, and the Ainu of Hokkaido, the indigenous peoples of Hokkaido, have considered consider a fish owl almost like a deity, like, the god that brings salmon to the village. So humans have known about fish owls for a while, but it wasn't until Thomas Blakiston, an English entrepreneur, came to Japan and shot one and sent it back. This was 1880 something, I think. Sent it back to the British Museum as a he thought it was a Eurasian eagle owl, but the fellow there who was looking over the birds, Henry Seebohm, saw that it was something different, so he named it after the guy who shot it. That's why it's called Blackinson's fish owl.
All right, so another one. How do your conservation efforts mesh with those protecting other endangered species in the region? Tigers, leopards, oriental storks, etc. Are there some synergies protecting fish owl habitats, protecting tiger habitats, for example, or is there not much overlap? And do you work with those groups?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I have a great answer, and it's that yes, absolutely. I mean, it's all connected. Almost, fish owls use river valleys. In winter, tigers use the frozen rivers just as we do to get along, because it's almost like walking on asphalt. There are Asiatic black bears hibernate in the same big trees that sometimes have fish owl nests in. So there's a tremendous amount of overlap. And I would say that so a big part of what my organization does in Russia is tiger conservation and leopard conservation. And so this just augments those ongoing efforts. So closing down some of these logging roads, right? The emphasis that we put out is that it's for tiger conservation. I mean, personally, it's for fish owl conservation, but it benefits all kinds of species.
That's great. I think a good follow-up to that one, we've got a question of what can people in the U.S. do to conserve fish owls? And I'm going to add my own follow-up of what can we do to benefit birds and owls. Like you mentioned, fish owls aren't in North America, but what kind of things that our audience members can do to help conservation of owls and birds in general?
Okay, yeah. As far as how to help fish owls, it is important to understand where your products are coming from. A few years ago, there was this scandal where lumber liquidators, and I don't think they go by lumber liquidators anymore, got caught essentially illegally bringing wood from Russia and saying it was Chinese wood and selling it in the United States. Oh. Understanding, trying to ensure that wood that you buy, that fish that you buy are from sustainable sources is really important. And this extends to even things like pine nuts. I would say most of the pine nuts for sale in the United States right now come from primordial forests. The pines are harvested. They're sent across the border into China, where they're processed and then sold as made in China or product of China. But they're not. They're Russian, and these are the same forests that the tigers live in, that the fish owls live in. And it's not a good industry right now. It's all being done legally, but it's completely unsustainable. It's being collected almost by slave labor, in my opinion. It's like slave labor. So look at your jar of pine nuts. Is it product of China? If it is, don't get it. I mean, there's other ways to get pine nuts, or there's other nuts you can put in your pesto that make the food just as good. So that's the big thing. We can feel like it's so separate from us. This place on the other side of the world, but we're global now. I think COVID shows us how global we are, and there are things we can do here that do have a direct impact on fish owls and tigers in Russia. As for what people can do for owls in North America, I've been trying to think of that in the back of my mind as I was answering the first question, and I didn't come up with anything. I feel like American conservationists have people that work here have a pretty good beat on these things, and they would answer the questions much better than me. So I do apologize that I couldn't come up with a good one there.
Very good. All right, we just got a couple more. So let's get to them. Were you able to secure grant funding to help do this doctoral research key for graduate work?
Yes, and that was a constant struggle, and it's one of the things. Actually, the book is almost a product of that because I was cobbling together these tiny little grants. So one of those GPSs cost like $2,000, and so the most I was able to get 5 of those. I would have purchased more, but with all the little small grants I was putting together, that's the most I could do. And so yeah, all the food, all the travel, the field assistant salary, all of that came from grants that either I wrote or Sergei Stromich wrote. And so as I was taking my field notes, I would turn those into fish owl updates that were PDFs that I would send to donors periodically from the field, when I'd be at an internet connection, just to keep them engaged and try to get them interested and maybe want to fund the project again next year. And those were the things that when I put those together, I had 40 pages. And then that was sort of the core, the genesis of the book, which I then just expanded on.
Excellent. All right, so our last question for the evening. Your photography is excellent, very thoughtfully composed. Do you have a history in photography or photojournalism, and what kind of camera are you using?
I use a Canon, and honestly, I forget which model. It's a good one. I just don't remember what it's called off the top of my head. I don't have any formal training in that, I think, as my answer thus far has indicated. And not all those photos were mine. I did give credit with the ones that were not mine. Some of them were from camera traps. So just a remote camera that's either up in a tree. There was a gorgeous shot of the owl on the nest after a fresh snow, and that was just the camera took that. I didn't take that one. So.
Gorgeous. All right, well, that's it for our audience Q&A. Is there any last fish owl wisdom you want to leave our audience with?
No, I mean, just that I've been absolutely thrilled by how many people have come to this event and how many people seem genuinely interested in reading about owls in Russia. I didn't think that people would want to do that, but hey, it's great. I'm really glad people are reading the book.
Yeah, same. And we really encourage you folks to pick up a copy from Third Place Books, our local independent seller who's supporting us on this event. They are an absolutely excellent store. So if you have any book needs, get them from Third Place or otherwise just buy local. Thank you again, Jonathan, for an informative evening. And I had a lot of fun learning about owls and learning about Russia and chatting with you. So thank you. Hopefully we'll be able to host you again, maybe even in person in our actual building. Wouldn't that be something? All right. Well, good night, everybody. See you next time.